Today's daf is daf Nun Aleph. I just want to review what we finished yesterday on daf Nun Amid Beis, so we'll have an easy takeoff. The Gemara wanted to know if you derive something from a kal vachomer, so B is derived from A, can B now serve as a binyan av? And Rabbi Yirmiyah tried to determine whether or not you could do such a thing in Kodshim from the case of Malika with a Kal Vachomer of Rabbi Meir. And the question is whether the Malika, like Shchita, can be mitayer midei tumas beis hablia, even in the case of a treifa. So the Malika was done on a bird, whether it's a chatos or an ola, which was, as it turns out, to be a treifa. And now the question is, and this is going to be a machlokas tanoim, whether or not there is tumas beis hablia if a Kohen, for example, would go ahead and eat a kizayis of the basar of treifa that was already subject to malika. So Reb Meir says that there's no tumas beis hablia, and he's going to derive that, as we'll see momentarily, from a kal vachomer. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he holds that although it's true that in the case of a behema, the shchita, even if the behemoth turns out to be a treifa, is mitayar midei nevela, and therefore, if somebody comes in contact with this dead animal, this carcass, after it was shechted, he would not be contaminated. Nevertheless, if someone were to eat the oaf that turned out to be a treifa and was subject to its malika, he would be metame. And that's called tumas beis hablia when it hits his throat on the way down to his esophagus. And Rabbi Meir explains why there is no tumas beis hablia in that case of malika of a treifa, based on a kal vachomer, because the assumption of this kal vachomer of Rabbi Meir is that the nevela of a behema is much more chamur in terms of tumah v'tara than the nevela of an oaf. In the case of a nevela of behema, the chumrah goes as far as to generate, if you come in contact with the carcass, a tumas maga umasa. Whereas in the case of nevela, in an oaf, there's no such thing as tumas maga umasa. The only tumah that you could contract from the nevela, the carcass of an oaf, would be tumas beis hablia. So the chumrah of nevelas behema goes way, way beyond that of an oaf in terms of tumah v'tara. And nevertheless, the Torah teaches us that if a behema was a treifa, but he went ahead and he shechted it, then it's no longer mitame. So kal vachomer, in the case of nevelas oaf, if the oaf turns out to be a treifa, then since he did malika, which is a substitute to replace shchita, that also would remove the tumas beis hablia. Again, in the case of an oaf, the only thing that you could possibly remove in terms of tumah would be beis hablia, because there is no additional tumah in the case of an nevelas oaf, whereas an nevelas behema has the additional tumah of mago masa, and then we're saying that the shchita, despite the fact that the animal was a treifa, is mitayr. And Rabbi Akiva derives from that a kal vachomer that certainly in the case of an oaf, if it was subject to malika and it turns out to be a treifa, then swallowing a kizayis from that oaf would not engender a contamination of tumas beis hablia, because the malika, like the case of shchita in a behema, would be mitayr midei nevela. Now we want to go one step further. Once having established this kal vachomer, we want to add what's called a bamematzinu, otherwise known as a binyan av. Those are synonymous terms. And this binyan av which is now on the top of our daf for today, on Daf Nun Aleph, is going to teach us that since there is a great similarity between shchita in behema, and we're talking now about a behemoth's chulin, mind you, and malika in the case of an oath of kodshim, in that in the case of shchita of a behemoth's chulin, the shchita is matir the isra achila, right? There's a double isra achila on a behemoth's chulin. It's number one, Aver min achai, because right now it's alive. And number two, it's also, after it dies, nevela. So both of these isurim are being removed through shchita. And that shchita also, if it was a perfectly good shchita, even if the animal turns out to be a treifa, it's mitayr mitumas nevela. And now through the binyan av, we're going to derive that even malika, which, as we said, is matir the basar ba'achila, just like in chulin, shchita is matir the basar ba'achila and removes the Yisrael Menachai and nevela. Therefore, it makes sense that even in the case that the bird turns out to be a treifa, nevertheless, the malika will achieve the same goal as shchita, to be mitayr the tuma of the nevelas oath, in this case, an oath of kodshim. Rabbi Yossi Omer, daya benivlas kinivlas behema tahora sheshchitasa mitaras v'lo malikasa. The Torah was only mechadesh this tremendous new halacha that the shchita is mitayr midei tumas nevela in a behema of beis habliya in chulin, only as far as shchita. That was a separate halacha in shchita. You have no right, therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, to extrapolate and go one step further and assume that that halacha of being mitayr midei nevela that applies to shchita, therefore ipso facto should apply to malika. And that's where he used the word daya. Daya means it's enough. In other words, the chiddush of malika equals shchita is far, it goes far enough as far as being matir the basar. We can't take that equation one step further and determine that even in Tuma, the Malika is like the Shechita and has the power, the ability to remove Tuma. But in any event, when we go back to Rabbi Meir on the one hand uses a Kal V'chomer, and then he takes that Kal V'chomer one step further by extending it with a binyan av. And Velohi, the Gemara rejects it. Because when you think about it, the binyan av that equates malika with shchita is talking about shchita of chulin. Our discussion about whether or not you can pile up a binyan av on top of a kal v'chomer is only in kodshim, not in chulin. And therefore the Gemara says, Hasam, in the case that Rabbi Meir, the truth be told is that Rabbi Meir uses actually a binyan av, which is a hekesh, which compares malika to shchita, but again, that's all in the case of chulin. Tehevi he, okay, fine. You want to combine a kal v'chomer together with a, well, we'll call it either a hekesh or a binyan av, that's okay. But that's only as far as chulin are concerned, because the malamed is the shchita of behemas chulin. Is mishchita de chulin kasinon? I mean, the entire discussion that we have as to whether or not you can pile up a binyan av on top of a kal v'chomer is only with a vis-a-vis kodshim. Because in kodshim, you can't derive something that's already a derivative. the ein halamed lomed min halamed. But in the case of chulin, which is not kodshim, that's a different story. There we always derive a lamed min a lamed. So if B is derived from A, then C could be derived from B. And that's exactly the case of Rabbi Meir. Now, it seems that this sugya here depends on the sugya that we learned yesterday and the day before yesterday with regard to Ravina and Rav Papa and Mar Zutra, because Rabbi Meir has, number one, the shchita of behemas chulin. Number two, he would talk about the shchita of an oaf of chulin, and then he goes on to kodshim in the case of malika. So therefore, 2 out of 3 of the elements in Rabbi Meir's development, his logical development, are actually in chulin, but one of them is in kodshim, because at the end of the day, we're talking about malika in an oaf, chatos or ola. And that depends upon the whole sugya that we learned the day before yesterday, whereas Mar Zutra was the one who was mitakev, he was very stiff, and he said that if there's an element of chulin in your logical thinking, it cannot prove anything about kodshim. And here, there are even 2 out of 3 elements of chulin. But on the other hand, if we go with Rav Papa and Ravina accepted Rav Papa, then if at the end of the day you're deriving something in kodshim, then you are obligated, you're bound, I should say, to the same rules of exegesis and deriving halachas that apply to kodshim. Next, Dover Alamed Bibinyan Av. So you derive B from A in a binyan Av, which is basically an equation, an analogy. Right? We have 4 methods of deriving halachas. Which of those methods could combine with a binyan Av? Number 1, hekesh. Number 2, gzeira shava. Number 3, kal v'chomer. Number 4, binyan Av. And the Gemara is going to say that out of these 4 possibilities that combine with the original binyan Av, I can answer your question only about one of the 4, and that's called pshot miyachada. Mipnei ma omru, the Brisa says, lon bidam kosher. Okay, now we're going to analyze the application of a principle. What is that principle? The principle goes as follows. Kevan sha'olu shuv lo yardu. You may recall that we touched upon this maybe 2 weeks ago. That if you have a psul in a carbon, which would mean that the carbon should be just gotten rid of, but you went ahead, whichever coin it was, and put it on top of the mizbeach, then it becomes lachmo shel mizbeach and lo yardu. We'll burn it on the mizbeach. So you shouldn't have put it up there, but if it was already up there, then it doesn't come down. And this sugya that we're about to learn is going to analyze the application, or shall we say the scope and the extent to which we apply this principle of Misha Olu Lo Yerdu. The classic case of Misha Olu Lo Yerdu is referring to the emurim. The emurim of the carbon are those parts of the fats of the carbon that have to be burnt on the mizbeach after the 4 avodas of the zevach were implemented. And then there was a psul. If there was a psul, let's say, for example, the emurim were taken outside the azar, that's called a psul of yotze. Well, let's say the emurim contracted tumah. A sheretz fell on the emurim, and that's called a tameh. And so normally, once this basar of emurim either was possible because of yotze, maybe it was possible because of the Kohen's machshava, or it was possible because it contracted tumah. In all those cases, with regard to the emurim, if it went up on the Mizbech, it doesn't come down. Our question is, what about dam? Right, the dam, if it became possible, for example, the dam was taken outside of the Azar. Example number 2, the dam was left until after Shkiyas Achama, and that's called dam nifsal b'Shkiyas Achama. So if he didn't do the zrika of the dam on the Mizbeach on the same day that they did the shchita and the Kabbalah Sadam, etc., then the dam becomes possible. Would that dam, if accidentally brought up on the Mizbeach, remain on the Mizbeach, or do we have to take it down from the Mizbeach? Lun b'dam kosher. Lun means that you left the dam past Shkiyas Achama, and that's a psul of lina. Again, you could equally come up with other psulim in dam. Maybe he had the wrong machshava at the time of the zrikas hadam. Maybe the dam contracted tumor, whatever it might be. But this case is a case of lina, where he left the dam without throwing it onto the mizbeach until nightfall. And now the question is, if it was brought up on top of the mizbeach and it's possibly din lina, do we apply the principle of im olu lo yerdu? And the answer is yes, that lan b'dam kosher. Now the word kosher here is a little bit misleading. The dam is possible. It was possible because of lina, he left it overnight. But it's kosher in the sense that if the dam got onto the mizbeach, then that dam that reached the mizbeach, even though the dam is possibly din lina, is im olu lo yerdu. And the Brisa now is asking, from whence do we know this halach? Meaning, Bishlam, in the case of Emurim, the Torah says explicitly that if it went up on the Mizbeach, it doesn't come down. But how do you know to extrapolate that same logic would apply to the case of dam? That even though the dam is possible, im olu lo yerdu. And the Gemara is going to extrapolate this from what's called a binyan av. And it is the following: Sharei lon be'emurim kosher. Again, the word kosher here, let's not get confused. If there was lina on the emurim, right, the emurim were meant to be burnt on that day, he left it beyond that day to the next day, then it's possible. And now it got onto the mizbeach, it becomes kosher. We will burn it on the mizbeach. And let's understand that if we're equating dam with emurim, we're going to have to go back and establish that emurim themselves, if they became possible, but olu lo yerdu. Where does that come from? And that comes from sharei lon b'basar kosher. Right? The Torah says black and white with regard to basar that if in the case of shlomim actually, that if the basar was lon, and it was left overnight, then it's fit for whatever it is, for, let's say, in the case of emurim, for burning on the mizbeach. Now, keep in mind that these words, sharei lon b'basar, kosher, are very difficult, because the Gemara, the Brisa, is pointing to shlomim. Shlomim get 2 days. So if you leave the basar of shlomim overnight, it doesn't become possible with lina. There's no lina overnight. He's got a whole full day, the second day, to take care of the kodshim, the shlomim. So that's going to be a pella, which we're going to, later on when we get to the point that we can explain Tosfos's approach, we'll try to deal with that question. In any event, let's focus on lina, right? Lina means that it was left until after Shkiyas Achama. And we can make an equation here between dam and the emurim, and between the emurim and the basar of karban shlomim. So basically, what we have here, because the rest of the printed text of the Talmud really belongs to a separate part. But as far as what we want to get out of this with the rules of exegesis, this is where the sugya ends. And basically what we're saying is that if you start with a binyan av, you can build a second binyan av on top of the first binyan av, which answers one of the four questions, one of the four combinations. Binyan av will link up with a binyan av. Because again, we're going to derive dam in the case of lina, where it became possible after shkia, to the case of a murim in lina. And in both these cases, we're going to apply the principle of him olu lo yerdu. But then the murim themselves are derived from the case of shlamim, of basar shlamim that were left overnight, which is another binyan av. So we have a binyan av that's built on another binyan av. Okay, fine. That's right now what we need to know. The rest of this Gemara for a while now is a digression. After we finish the digression, we'll come back to analyze this and see this proof that you can have a binyan av in Kodshim that's built on a binyan av. But first, we have the case of Yotze. Now, Yotze is a little bit different than Lina. Both are psulim, but whereas Lina means overnight, Yotze means it was taken out of that makom where it was supposed to be. For example, it's supposed to be in the Azara, and it was taken out of the Azara. Now, what the Brisa is going to do here is in every case of a mitzius that would create a psul in the basar or the murim, etc., is there a hechetimtza where you could make it kosher, even though it's possible? And once we identify such a possibility, such a scenario, then we apply the principle of him olu lo yerdu. So, for example, in the case of a yotze, where it was taken out of the Azara, is there a possibility under the sky, under the constellation of Kodshim, that yotze would not passel a korban? And the answer is yes, and that's called bama. As we discussed in the past, and the whole sugi is at the end of Zevachim, there was a shas heter bamos, a time period in which you were allowed to set up your own private altar wherever you wanted to do and bring karbanos on your own private bama. And with regard to the basar that was designated for a bama, there's no psul of yotze, because bama could be set up anywhere on the face of the earth, probably even on the moon. And therefore, there's no such thing as restricting the location for a karba that's brought on a bama. So therefore, yotze kosher b'bama. The language of the Gemara is very, very strange, very ambiguous. What do you mean kosher b'bama? There is no psul of yotze b'bama. It's a funny kind of thing. We want to say him olu lo yerdu after there was a psul. It was a chalos psul, and now you took it up to the mizbeach, and that's going to sort of be machshir apostle. Here we're talking about a case where there is no psul yotze because there's no yotze. But in any event, that's the mechanics of this sugya, and we're going to go through one case after the other where even though it's possible, but nevertheless it could be kosher. For example, a tameh. Let's say that the murim contracted tumah, and obviously that means they're possible. You can't bring them on the mizbeach. I'm going to establish that in olu lo yerdu based on the fact that there is a case of tumah where it's kosher. And what's that? Hol v'hutar b'avodas tzibur, right? If let's say rov hatzibur was tameh, then we will bring the karban b'tumah. So we already have a precedent where tumah, even though it became tameh, could be kosher. and that's called avodas hatzibur. Now, I didn't exactly chap what he says here. I'm not sure. He quotes a Gemara in Tamura here in the footnote, and he says that this heter applies to a Kohen who's doing the avodas hatzibur, and it also applies to the kli shares. Now, again, I didn't understand that the heter of avodas tzibur was referring to the Kohen who contracted tumah. I thought that avodas tzibur was referring to the tzibur that contracted tumah. But he seems to be saying no, that even if the Kohen, who's now doing the avodah of the korban tzibur, he became tamei, then he could do the avodah. So that he claims is a sugya in Tamura. I'm not learning Tamura, so I don't know. I can't be responsible for that. Now, what about another case of apostle, which we want to know, Olu Yeredut? Is there a case where it's kosher? Chutzes mano. Now, chutzes mano is a case where, let's say, the Kohen at the time of the Shechita or at the time of the Kabbalah had in mind that, everything should happen chutzes mano. That's pigul, and that generates a chiyuv kares. Where are you going to find a case where that's mutter? Chol meratza lepigulo. Okay, so this comes back to another discussion that we had. This is one of the most esoteric dimensions of kodshim, that pigul will only apply when everything, with the exception of that machshava that he had lechutzes mano, everything else was done b'kashrus. And the what's the word I want to use? The oxymoron here, if you will, is or let's use the word what's counterintuitive, is that after the machshavas chutzes mano, everything else was done perfectly. Do you remember that? So that's called kosher. And here we have a case where you have a machshava chutzes mano, and yet, with regard to the avodos that come subsequent to that avodah, let's say shchita that he had a machshava chutzes mano, all those avodos were performed perfectly, bekashus. And that's going to be the basis for the fact that that pigul, we finished with tuma, that pigul im olu lo yerdu, chutzum komo, hova hukesh chutzes mano. So we don't have to break our heads over the case of chutzum komo, because chutzum komo is always equated with chutzes mano. And in both cases, you have a psul carbon, but in both cases, we're going to say that the avodos subsequently were done b'kashrus. Shekiblo psulim, or zarku damam. So let's say that a zar, a non-Kohen, would do the Kabbalas Hadam, or he would actually do the Zrikas Hadam al Gabi Mizbeach. How could that ever be mutter? That you're going to say afterwards, Im Olu Lo Yerdu, and the answer is Bahanach Psulim de Chazu Avodas Tzibur. Because when it comes to the Kohanim, who are apostle, then we divide them up into two different categories. There are categories where the Kohen, for example, was apostle because he contracted tumah, and then there are psulim, right? So again, let's go back to that case where the Kohen contracted tumah. He could do the avodah of a korban tzibur, again under certain circumstances. Masha Enken, let's say in the case of a zar. Right, a zar could never do the avodah, not of a yochid, of avodas korban yochid, korban tzibur. It wouldn't make any bit of a difference. But at least in those cases where the apostle would be ro'il avodah in avodas tzibur, namely a case where the Kohen contracted tumah, in that case we have a heter, and we now can activate the principle of him olu lo yerd. Okay, now after this whole digression, the Gemara goes back now to the Reisha of the Brisa, which was the main focal point of our discussion, as to whether or not at least according to Rabbi Meir, we can derive a binyan av from a binyan av. And just to reiterate, according to Rabbi Meir, and it would, by the way, I mentioned Rabbi Meir here because Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, but I don't know that anyone disagrees with this. So maybe we should drop the name Rabbi Meir here, leave it out. But again, we want to know, how do you know that dam has the same halacha as a murim? Meaning that im olu lo yerdu, if the dam became possible through lina and it was left past shkia, we know it from a murim. How do we know a murim? A murim we know from basar. Now, what does basar mean? Again, that's the paradox of this sugya. Basar means shlamim, which can be left overnight. But be that as it may, we are building one binyan av on top of the other. And the Gemara says the following: I don't know that proves a thing. Why? V'chidanin davar shelo b'echshero midavar shebechshero. You're talking about lina, and you're going to derive with a binyan av that lina im ola lo yered, even though it's possible, from the case of shlamim where it's kosher, right? Because shlamim is eaten for 2 days. So the whole entity here of a binyan av to derive from basar shlamim, any conclusions about a murim and then from a murim to go over to dam, in the case of Yotzei, it's totally irrelevant. How can you make that equation? You're asking whether a apostle could be kam kosher and undergo a transformation through Alu, through the fact that it was put on the Mizbech. And you're going to derive it from the fact that Shlomim, there's no Psul Yotzei. So the Gemara says, Tana, the Tana, therefore, must be building himself not on this binyan av, but rather he's building himself on something else. And what is he building himself on? Mizos Torah Ha'olah, Riba Samachle. The entire development in which we want to establish that in Dam Shenitma Belina Im Olu Lo Yerdu is all based on the Pasuk Zos Torah Ha'olah. Now, what do we see in the Pasuk Zos Torah Ha'olah? We see an equation here between all the different dimensions of the Akrovas Karban Olah. And in that context, Dam is to be, let me start the other way around, the din of a murim should be extended to include Dam. So basically, what we're left with here, if you ask me, but again, Tosfos is not going to say like that, but it seems like the Gemara has no final proof that we're going to be able in Kodshim to build a binyan av on another binyan av. However, Tosfos seems to learn otherwise. Let's first read the pasuk. Zos Torah Ha'olah, hi ha'olah al mokdah al mizbeach kol halayla. Now, the word Zos seems to be a mute. And if the subject of this pasuk is im olu lo yerdu, then Zos is coming to exclude some case. Then we have the word he, right? Zos Torah Ha'olah, he. He is also an exclusion. And then finally it says ha'olah, and that's also a mute. We don't know what the Torah is telling us. Is the Torah intimating as to which psul is subject to him olu lo yerdu and which psul is outside the purview of him olu lo yerdu? Now, there's a Gemara that we have to know about on Daf Pei Dalid, and Rabbi Yehuda in that Gemara establishes that whether or not Im Olu Lo Yerdu will apply in certain psulim depends upon whether there's a case of that puzzle where we overlook that disqualification and we're machshir. And that's what the Brisa does. It goes through various situations in which the psul does not apply. As we saw before in the case of chutzlim komo with regard to bama. So therefore, what comes out here is, based on the Sugi of Rabbi Yehuda later on in Pei Daled, that this pasuk, Zos Toras HaOla, is really the source for the halacha of which disqualifications come under the halacha of Im Olu Lo Yerden, which do not. So there's no specific binyan av over here, right? It's all based on the logic of whether or not there is a situation which the Torah dispenses with the psul. And therefore, it would seem that at the end of the day, this Gemara is giving up on the proof to establish that a binyan av could be based on a binyan av. And that is Shitas Rashi. So honestly, I don't know how Tosas gets away with this. Okay, so that's a subject that requires study. So again, the bottom line in this sugya, again, we'll reiterate it, is Tana mizos Toras ha'ola riba samachlev. That's the basis for the halacha that Im Olu Lo Yerdu, but not this binyana, which takes us back to Shlom. Okay, Shiari Adam. Okay, now we're going to learn about what's called Shvichas Shirayim. There was dam that was left over after the Zrika, and the dam is in the Klishores. You have to pour it on the Yisod HaMizbeach. So we want to know a few things. Number one, which Mizbeach? Number two, where is the Yisod? And which area of the Mizbeach is it? So now, we first want to know, what is the source in the Torah for Shvichas Shirayim, my time? Omakra, El Yisod, Mizbach HaOla. Now, the word Mizbach HaOla is a synonym for the Mizbeach HaChitzon, otherwise known as the Mizbach HaNechoshes. So that Mizbeach is the real McCoy Mizbeach, where 99% of the avodas are done, and it has three names, right? It's called the Mizbeach HaChitzon, it's called the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, or called the Mizbach HaOla, which is a biblical term. And El Yisod means that you're going to look for the Yisod of that Mizbeach, as we said before, the external Mizbeach that's in the Azara and not in the Heichal. And then it says Asher Pesach, Ol Moed. So what's the Asher Pesach? So there's the Yisod of the Mizbach Ola and there's the Pesach. And the answer is Hahu de Poga Bereisha. So when the Kohen finishes his avoda and he's going to look into his mizrach, into the kli, and see if there's dam left over, then he should be pouring the dam on the yisod, which he encounters first. And apparently, again, we need a little bit of a diagram here, which I don't know if you have it. I don't have a diagram here, but there's something called the Ma'arav. Ma'arav translates into English as the West. So where is the Kohen in relationship to the Yesod HaMizbeach? And the answer is that he is closest to the western side of the Mizbeach. That's where the Yesod is. And that's called Paga Bereisha. That's going to be the first base or section of the base that he encounters after he finishes the Zrika Sadam. And now he's going to pour the Shirayim onto the western base. So you got 4 directions, and the base is a square. We'll see that it's open on one side, but not even now it's going to have to be a Shvicha Shirayim on the Marav. Now keep in mind the Torah uses the term Oel Moed, but Oel Moed is really the equivalent to the Azara in the Beis Hamikdash. So Oel Moed to Mishkan equals Azara in Beis Hamikdash. So he points out here in the note that what the Gemara is operating with is a principle called Ein Mavirin al HaMitzvos. What does that mean, Ein Mavirin al HaMitzvos? So let me give you, the real Ein Mavirin al HaMitzvos is either in Megillah with regard to Adar Sheni, and when do you read the Megillah, or Shvicha Shirayim. There are many other cases where we'd like to apply the principle of Ein over an al mitzvahs, but we don't really apply it. Like, for example, if you pick up Yishal Rosh before you picked up Yishal Yad, then once the Shal Rosh is in your hands, the Nemuki Yosef claims that we apply the principle of Ein Mavir al mitzvahs, and you'll actually put on the Shal Rosh first because you picked up the Shal Rosh first. A similar halacha will apply in Shvichas Shirayim, where if the first Yesod or direction of the Yesod that you encounter is on the west, that's where you want to do the Shvichas Shirayim. Don't waste your time passing the west, which is the first one that you encounter, to go to the north, south, whatever, and do the Shvichas Shirayim there, because you're being over ala mitzvahs. Over means you're passing over a mitzvah. And the Gemara applies that svara in Masechta Megillah, in the case of Adar Sheni, to require Megillah reading in Adar Rishon. Again, the Gemara goes back and forth on this, but because if you're going to delay the Kriyas HaMegillah till Adar Sheni, then you are over ala mitzvah. So the Kohen, he writes here, approaches the western base first when he comes out, and we're not going to pass over it. There is another girsa here in the Gemara that doesn't have Hahu de Paga Bereisha, which simply means that we're not operating with Ein over and al mitzvahs, but simply Xeris HaKosa. The Torah says that the Yesod on which he pours the Shirayim, the remnants of the Dam, is on the western Yesod. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa, El Yesod Mizbach HaOla. Now this pasuk appears, I think, 3 times in the Torah. The first time it appears is in Vayikra Perek Dalet. And we're talking about Par Kohen Gadol. And what does the pasuk say? It says, "V'nasana kohen min adam al karnos mizbach ktores hasamim lifnei Hashem asher b'ol moed v'yas kol dam hapar yishpoch el yisod mizbach ha'ola asher pesach ha'olma." So clearly, we're talking about the partial kohen gadol, and we're talking about the nesina on the mizbeach ha-pnimi, right? Al-Kanas Mizbach ha-Ktores. Mizbach ha-Ktores is the golden Mizbeach inside the Heichal. And then, as kol adam, which means the remnants of the dam, after he did the zrika on the mizbeach hazav, in the case of Paro Shel Kohen Gadol, yishpoch el yisod mizbach ha'olah. So it's interesting. He's splitting up his avoda into two mizbachos. The zrika itself will be on the mizbeach ha'pnimi, the mizbach hazav, mizbach ha'ktoros, but the shvich hashirayim will take place on the mizbeach ha'olah, which is the mizbach ha'chitzon. So the Brisa now darshins v'lo yisod mizbeach ha'pnimi. Now the words of the Brisa seem to indicate that just like there's a yisod in the mizbach ha'olah outside the heichal, there's also a yisod in the mizbeach hazav inside the heichal, and the Torah is telling us el yisod mizbach ha'olah to be machadish that even though the zrikas hadam in the case of Paro Shel Kohen Gadol was in the inner mizbeach, but nevertheless the shvich hashirayim is going to be on the yisod of the mizbeach ha'olah. However, the Torah repeats this again, el yisod mizbach ha'olah, and this is in the same perek Dalid of Vayikra, but we fast forward to a different kind of par, and that's the par helim dover shel tzibur, and that's in Pasuk Yudches. And there too, the Torah repeats itself and writes El Yisod Mizbach HaOlah. So we now have two contexts in which the Torah uses the same four words El Yisod Mizbach HaOlah. First, we have it with regard to the par of Yom Kippurim, right? Just 1 second. Forget that. Wait, scratch that for a second. No, I'm sorry, the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol. Now we have it a second time in the Par Helem Dover Shel Tzibur. And then we're going to have it a third time in the Soyer Shel Nasi. Let me see if I got that right. We'll see that in a minute. Right. The Soyer Shel Nasi. Again, all these three times that the Torah repeats itself with regard to Shvich HaShirayim on the Yisod, the Torah uses the words Mizbach Ha'olah to indicate that the Shvich HaShirayim must be on the outer Mizbech. Now, we're going to learn three different halachos from these three different psukim. The first halacha that we're going to learn is that the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol, although the avodah is done bifnim and the zrika is on the mizbeach hazav hapnimi, nevertheless the shirayim is going to go to the mizbeach hachitzon. The second pasuk, which, as we said before, is written in the parsha of Par Helam Dov Shel Tzibur, is Ein Lo Yisod LeMizbeach LePnimi Atzmo. Okay, so it's teaching us that there's no such thing as Yisod in the Mizbeach HaPnimi. I'm not sure if the Gemara means that physically there's no, I think it means physically, yeah, that the sides of the Mizbeach, it was a very small Mizbeach, would go up and down, straight down to the ground. There was no base on the bottom. Now we have a third time with regard to the Soyer Shel Nasi, where the Torah again says, Al Yisod Mizbach Ha'olah. Now notice there's a slight difference here. No, I don't know. I thought there was a slight difference. Let me just go. El Yisod Mizbach HaOlah. El Yisod Mizbach HaOlah. El Yisod Mizbach HaOlah. Okay. It's the same exact four words. So what do we derive now from the third pasuk of the repetition of El Yisod Mizbach HaOlah? Tein Yisod L'Mizbeach Shel Olah. So what's the chiddush of the third pasuk here? I mean, the case of Sa'ir Shel Nasi is a case of a Sar Hachitzonin. I mean, what would be the Havamina that you would take the dam inside the Mizbeach Hapnimi for this purpose of Shvichas Yisod? I don't know. O Eno Ella Mizbecha Shel Ola Yehei Liyisod. Maybe the last pasuk is coming to teach us that when the Kohen does the zrika on the mizbeach, he should be absolutely sure that mizbacho shel ola yehei liyisod. Now, apparently, in the four corners of the mizbeach, there was one corner that had no yisod, and that's the mizrach darom. The mizrach darom, or darom mizrach, the southeast corner of the mizbeach had no yisod. Rabbi Shmuel, kal v'chomer. I don't need a pasuk to teach me that the Shvicha Shirayim has to be on the Yisod of the Mizbeach HaChitzon, because Ma Shirayim she'ein mechaprim to unim Yisod is Tchilas Ola she'mechaperes ein odin to uni Yisod. In other words, if you're going to be machmir and require a Yisod, then you'd be more likely to require it with regard to the Tchilas HaOla, right? The original Dam. So we're now coming lafuke, a very strange havamina, that maybe the original Zrikas Adam would have to be on the Yisod of Mizbeach. But that can't be, says Rabbi Yishmael, because Shirayim is not part of the Kapara. The Kapara was already finished with the four avodas culminating in Zrika. So if Shirayim, which is not Machaper, requires Yisod, then there's not even a havamina that the Tchilas Ola, which means the original Zrika, which would be on the would be on the Yisod. Enodinsha to Uni Yisod. Just 1 second. I see. In other words, the Zrika of the Dam on the first round, which is called Tchilas Ola, should be on that corner of the Mizbeach that underneath it has a base, has a Yisod. Lafuke, the Drom Mizrach. And the Kal Vachomer Rabbi Shmuel establishes that, and we don't need a pasuk for that, because if Shirayim could only be fulfilled in that part of the Mizbeach that has a Yisod, then how much more so the original Zrika has to be done on the Mizbeach in a place that corresponds to the Yisod, that has the Yisod underneath it. Now, Rabbi Akiva is quoted here in the Brisa, and he's going to reiterate basically what Rabbi Shmuel had already said. And the Gemara later on, not today but tomorrow, is going to try to figure out what Rabbi Akiva add here, because he says the same Kal V'chomer. He says Ma shirayim she'em mechaprim ve'enam boim lekapara. Right, because again, as we said before, the kapara was already clinched at Zrika. It's Tu'una Yisod, and yet the Torah says that you have to take the dam and you have to pour it on the Yisod, even though the Shirayim is not a kapara. It's Chilas Ola, right, the first blood that generates the kapara. Shemechaperes, Ubala kapara, Enodin Shetuna Yisod. Right, it has to be in that part of his Beach, Lafuke, the Drom Mizrah. Okay, now in Cain, this is both Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Ma Tamalom, we're back to square one. Why did the Torah, in the case of Sa'ir Shel Kohen, right, why does it say El Yisod Mizbach HaOla? Again, this is completely superfluous, because this we could derive from a Kal V'chomer.
Setting the thing up.
So the answer is Tain Yisod L'Mizbacha Shel Ola. So what we're doing is we're taking one case and extrapolating all the other cases. So from the case of one carbon, we're going to extrapolate that whatever shirayim you have from any other carbon, it's got to be poured on the base of the mizbech. Omar Mal El Yisod Mizbach HaOla V'lo Yisod Mizbech HaPnimi. So Gemara says that how can you darshan halachas from the words El Yisod Mizbach HaOla when the Torah is just describing exactly where you have to do the shvichas shirayim? Not on the inner mizbeach where you did the zrika, but on the outer mizbeach. So that's called hami boile legufe. So the Gemara answers mi asher pesach o moed nafka. So when it says here in the pasuk El Yisod Mizbach HaOla, and it says Pesach Oel Moed, so from the Pesach Oel Moed pasuk, I already derive the gufe, meaning the gufe means that the shvicha of the shiraim has to be done on the Yisod Mizbeach, because it says Asher Pesach Oel Moed. So why then did the Torah have to add Mizbach HaOla? And the answer to the Mizbach HaOla is coming lafuke, that you shouldn't think that since the Avodas Hadam is done on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, therefore the Shvicha Shiraim should likewise be done on the Mizbeach HaPnimi. Now the third time, which the Torah repeats again, El Mizbeach HaZav HaOla, we'll just read one line here, is Tain Yisod L'Mizbach Shel Ola. The Isal Kedaitach Kirich Siv, if you're going to explain the pasuk literally, Ein Mikriyotzim De Pshuto, Lama Likra, why do I need this pasuk? Are you going to tell me L'Shirayim? I mean, let's say, for example, the Nasi brings this Korban Chatos with a soy. So you're telling me that the leftover dam should be poured on the Mizbeach HaZav. I'm sorry, on the Mizbeach HaOla, and not on the Mizbeach HaZav. Habroi Ovid Lahu. In other words, we already did the avoda on the Mizbeach HaPnimi. So now you might ask, well, if the avoda was done on the Mizbach Hazav, then maybe the Shvicha Shirayim should also likewise be done on the Mizbach Hazav. How do you know that the Torah is saying no, that you should take the dam now outside of the Heichal and pour it on the base, on the Yisod of the Mizbach Hazav? V'chi tema di apich mepach is the broi legavoy ugavoy lebroi ha'en lo Yisod pnimi v'atzmo. Right? Maybe you're going to switch it around and say no, that since you started the Zrikas Adam on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, therefore you should do the Shvika Shirayim on the Mizbeach HaPnimi. But that can't be, because the Mizbeach HaPnimi, as we said before, has no Yisod. Okay, I think we'll stop here because we're already finished with the daf. And Mirza Hashem will continue on Daf Nun Beis tomorrow. Have a great day.